Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to Book Trek 2021. This is a 5-month mission I'm embarked on with a bunch of other booktubers where we're reading Star Trek fiction for the rest of 2021. We started in August with the original series, My Star Trek, Kirk, Spock, and McCoy, reading the novels, a wide span of the novels. At least I was. There's a bit of a discrepancy here, a bit of a dysmorphia between my videos in Book Trek and all the videos of my co-hosts, as you could expect, and I think they expected it too, because I read a lot more than most people do, and I have more time. They have jobs and families and loved ones and school and responsibilities and personal hygiene and pants. I don't have any of those, so I've been covering a lot of Star Trek. And then we moved on to the Next Generation, and that was a great deal of fun for me because I didn't like the Next Generation. I had decades of comedy routines denigrating it. Didn't think there was much worthwhile there at all. I thought it was very didactic, very boring Star Trek. And I was wrong about that. Happy to know how wrong I was about that. Not maybe so much the novels. I didn't encounter a whole lot of great fiction. That might be sentimental. It might be just that I love reading about the original cast so much that I'm gilding the lily on the books themselves. But I don't think so. I think the more lawyers from Paramount got involved in the novels, the less good the novels were, just in general. But rewatching the show, the movies, and the episodes has been a revelation. Just a revelation. I understand now a lot of what the showrunners were going for. I understand now a lot of the differences that they were doing, that they were intentionally putting there between the first Star Trek, My Star Trek, and the Next Generation. And the foremost of those, the thing that ruined it for me from the beginning, was that Jean-Luc Picard is very much a boss. He's very much a manager, and not a friend, not a hero, not an icon. Jim Kirk, you sense, was beloved by his crew. And you don't ever get that sense with Picard. You get the sense they admire him, but not that they love him. And I automatically thought, well, if they don't love him, then what's the point? And I have been seeing the point, very much so seeing the point. The key for me was twofold, was to watch Riker and also to pay attention to the nuances of Patrick Stewart's acting as Jean-Luc Picard. So September was great. And then we come to October. October has been Deep Space Nine, which is a Star Trek iteration that I love. Set on a space station, not on a starship. Gigantic cast of alien characters, tons and tons of what I would argue is the beginning of massive, coherent world building of a type you can't do in a show when your ship is constantly moving. The world building in Deep Space Nine is, I think, its foremost achievement. I love the show. The more it went on, the more I loved it. I think a couple of the greatest Star Trek scenes or episodes take place in Deep Space Nine. And I would also argue that the single greatest Star Trek scene of them all, in any incarnation of Star Trek, happens in Deep Space Nine. And some of you will know the scene I'm talking about. It does not involve humans. It does not involve Federation members. It doesn't take place on a starship. It's a scene between a Ferengi and a Cardassian, and it's about root beer. And it distills the whole essence of Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek in 5 minutes. I think it's the greatest Star Trek scene of them all. Despite that fact, the books have been rocky. The book experience has been rocky. The books have been largely crap. Largely terrible. Not just terrible in the sense that there's an item here or there that I could like and I can talk to you about, but so terrible that I want to expunge it from my memory. So we're going to do a little read-along today. And I hope you'll bear with me. We'll start with a quote. If we wish to discuss this matter thoroughly, we must ask whether these innovators should rely on themselves or on others. In other words, whether they should depend on prayer or on force. In the former case, they invariably fail. But when they rely on themselves and have prospered, when they rely on themselves and employ force, they run little risk. Hence it is that all armed prophets have prospered and all unarmed prophets have perished. The nature of the people is mutable, and while it is easy to persuade them, it is difficult to preserve them in their conviction. Hence, we must take such measures that, when they no longer believe, we may compel them to believe by force. If Moses, Cyrus, Theseus, and Romulus had been unarmed, They could not long have enforced their constitutions, as happened in our day when Fra Girolamo Savonarola, who was ruined by his new order of things, as soon as the crowd ceased to believe in him, since he had no means of preserving the loyalty of those who believed, and of making doubters believe. Making them believe. That's a close quote. Now we'll move on to the reading. Such was the mature judgment of Machiavelli. That's Niccolo Machiavelli, author of The Prince, who features prominently in this Deep Space Nine novel. Such was the mature judgment of Machiavelli on the revolutionary value of faith. I would argue that it's also a judgment of his on the importance of a standing army. Your own standing army, not somebody else's that you're leasing, but your own. In the past 2 months, he had seen the most spectacular confirmation of an axiom which, however self-evident, seemed always to be forgotten. The cardinal sin of Savonarola was his simplicity. And in the career on which Machiavelli was now embarking, that sin was inexcusable. He, at least, would not forget it. Savonarola briefly managed, through sheer charisma, to turn the progressive city of Florence into a theocracy, until he was burned at the stake. Yet this commonplace could never be sufficiently repeated, for even after that overwhelming demonstration of the futility of faith unsupported by force, which Savonarola had left Florence as his last legacy, his hard-headed countrymen had not learned their lesson, or at least they had not applied it to their politics and their warfare. And Machiavelli was touched in the quick of his professional conscience, for he was now a government official, a humble one, a subordinate, but in his own eyes a responsible one. 4 weeks after the execution of Savonarola, on July 19, 1498, he applied for the position of first secretary to the Signoria. Recommended by the chief of the first chancery, he was elected and immediately assumed charge of the second chancery. This office, it was true, admitted of no personal initiative. His duties consisted of dictating dispatches, compiling minutes, digesting reports, making transcripts, and annotating official files. But he was serving his apprenticeship, and it would be a poor drudge who, when beginning as first secretary to the Signoria, would not soon become something more than a bureaucrat. Life was opening for him. He was 29, open-eyed, close-mouthed, industrious, discreet, and his only handicap was the originality of his mind. He rarely agreed with his betters. Not that he was opinionated, but he smiled. In the corners of his mouth lurked a little crease which at least passed for a smile, something slyly subordinate, which, if he had permitted himself to smile, would have seemed subtly superior, but he had himself well in hand, as he had all the clerks in his office. Notice that the writer of this particular Deep Space Nine novel is thinking specifically about the portrait of Machiavelli that he has seen. He's imagining that while he's writing. They saw his mouth twitch and his nose pucker and his lynx-like eyes quicken, but that was all. In the palace, he kept his opinions to himself. In the pothouse, that is, the bar, however, among his intimates, at the end of the day, he aired them. There, in the atmosphere that favored their unfolding, close, mild, and warm, and saturated with the acrid aroma of the lees of the wine, he held forth to the little circle of devoted admirers, his subordinates in the chancery, and his intellectual inferiors, whom he dominated. There, after office hours, he played over the cards, that great game of political cafes which begins and ends with, "If I were." There, despite his intellectual aloofness, he expanded and became the most sociable of men, and his audience appreciated, or thought they appreciated, his ideas and his jokes. They could not always distinguish between them, both were so startling and so sensible, particularly when they were aimed at their superiors. Listening affectionately while he applied his corrosive criticism to the errors of the better vulgar, they were proud of him, and in that little club, dedicated to high thinking and low living, the foundations of his fame were laid. For personalities, the topic turned to principles. For already Machiavelli had an example of the muddle-headedness of his countrymen to harp on. 5 days after the execution of Savonarola, another ceremony had taken place in the piazza where Savonarola was burned. Took him all afternoon to die. This time it was a martial one. Marcello Virgilino Adriani, the chief of the first chancellery, pronounced a classical oration and conferred the baton of commander-in-chief of the Florentine forces on a competent condottieri, Pagolo Vitelli. Condottieri are soldiers for hire. They are the Dorsai. They are paid mercenaries. It only needed, or so it seemed, the passing of the great visionary for Florence to come to her senses, the great visionary here being Savonarola. I'm not going to argue with that. I'm just going to keep reading. After listening for so long to the friar who boasted that, quote, he held Pisa in the hollow of his hand. How did the song go? Oh, betrayer of the Florentines that have made bitter this state, hoping to recover its confines, fine soil you frittered away. The peace and war was last to be prosecuted in earnest. After negotiating for 4 years with the French, the Republic had emerged in 4 days from its delusions and begun to rely on itself. So far, so good. But it had only begun. The oration which celebrated this step, and the oration alone, was classical. The step itself was but a half-step, which begged the question of self-help. And a long stride was needed actually to emulate the example of the ancient Rome. Pagolo Vitelli was an able condottiere, one of the best in Italy, but he was a mercenary, and the breed was, in the very nature of things, unreliable. The true test of self-help was a national militia, the citizen soldiers of ancient Rome. There was no other solution. This, however, was one of the ideas which earned Machiavelli the name of an academic thinker among practical men, and in the pothouse it passed for one of his jokes. He could not seriously expect a nation of traders to bear arms when they could buy them. How could he not? How could he? He could not seriously expect Florence to break with a custom which every other state in Italy followed, the custom of hiring condottieri. But the retort was prompt. Where had it brought Italy? Where had that custom brought Italy? Why was it impossible that there were Swiss practice? Why was it impossible there in Italy when the Swiss practiced it so successfully? Not only did they owe their independence to military service, they supplied half the armies of Europe with crack troops. Or, to come nearer home, what of Pisa, where under the stress of necessity the whole city had taken up arms? But that was pushing too near home. His friends nodded and sighed. They did not argue, or only for sport, to lead him on by close reasoning to a new round of liquor. For Machiavelli, however, the idea was not academic. The whole conduct of the peace and war was in his hands. At least it passed through them. In addition to his work in the Signoria, he had been appointed secretary to the 10 on War as well, a war committee. He was in close touch with the camp, transmitting orders, munitions, and money, receiving confidential reports, and traveling about the territory. Nor was this all. The military campaign had to be accompanied and covered by a diplomatic one, for the peace and war again dictated the foreign policy of the Republic, and the international situation was once more becoming alarming. How rapidly history repeated itself! Charles VIII had died suddenly, and his successor, Louis XII, was preparing a new invasion to wipe out the disgrace of Fornovo, recover Naples, and take in Milan, Fornovo being a military disaster. This time it was not talk, nor was the invasion likely to be a mere seasonal visit or a military promenade. The new king had none of the flighty ambitions of his late cousin. He was cautious, shrewd, parsimonious, and tenacious, a conservative middle-class monarch, and he meant what he said. When he said that he would rather reign one day in Milan than a lifetime in France, he made the only romantic mark of his entire life. He was determined not only to have, but to hold. The new invasion would not pass like a bad dream. The proof of it was in the conduct of Ludovico Sforza in Milan. He was facing his old nightmare again. The league which he had fashioned at Fornovo, and which he had preserved for years, had suddenly disintegrated with the defection of its central member, the Pope. The patriotism of Alexander, that is the Pope, had yielded to other considerations. King Louis was seeking a divorce and a dispensation to marry the widow of Charles VIII, Anne of Brittany. In August of 1498, the Pope sent his son Caesar, that's Caesarea, to France with the coveted dispensation, and Caesar, who had recently renounced ecclesiastical orders, returned to Italy under a new name. Henceforth he was known as Valentino, and the Italians insisted on naturalizing his French title of the Duke of Valentinois. From that day, Ludovico Sforza slept fitfully. Once more he was isolated in Italy. He attempted to arrange a new scheme of alliances, but he met everywhere with the cold shoulder. In public he was careful not to appear crestfallen. With easy assurance he showed the Florentine ambassador a fresco representing the map of Italy covered with Gallic cocks, and a figure of himself with a broom sweeping them away, to cleanse Italy of all filth. It was a device of his own invention, as the ambassador immediately recognized. The literal Florentine saw little in the fresco. He observed bluntly that Ludovico might sweep himself away to dust with the dust that he raised, and the comment, that quip, was immediately successful in Florence. So Ludovico Sforza discovered that when he negotiated for an alliance with the Republic, he offered money and troops for the peace on war, but the government remained wary and evasive. After preserving its neutrality for so long and at such cost, it saw no reason to risk it on the eve of another invasion. It was too prudent, however, and too civil not to temporize. The effect of this policy on the peace on war was immediately apparent. Vitelli also temporized, and it was suspected that he was suborned by Ludovico Sforza. Nothing definite could be ascertained, however, and the mere fact of a protracted campaign was too normal with mercenaries to be conclusive proof of disloyalty. Secretly, he was held under surveillance. Publicly, his explanations were accepted. He complained of his pay and his supplies, compared them to those of his colleagues, and demanded an increase. Condottieri always did that. Explanations of this nature could only be met by accepting them. But the 10 on war had already squandered so much money without results that they were known among the people as the spending 10. Morally and financially, they were acutely embarrassed. Their secretary, sitting over their correspondence and digesting it, that's Machiavelli, listened and said nothing. Looking over the piazza and reflecting on how rapidly history repeated itself, Machiavelli silently nursed his faith that, quote, the ruin of Italy has been caused by resting all of her hopes for many years on mercenaries, and the men who told us that our sins were the cause of it spoke the truth, but they were not the sins he imagined. Again, more reverence for Savonarola, I will again refrain from arguing. Out of this situation grew his first mission, Machiavelli's first mission. To supplement the forces of Vitelli, it was decided to engage a contingent of mercenaries from Caterina Sforza, the Countess of Imola and Forli. Their value was not so much military as political, for the Countess was a neighbor, and her states were a buffer, and the Signoria was willing to sink some money to gain her goodwill, but only a little. It was essential to buy it cheaply. Here was a perfect problem for a young diplomat. His instructions were clear, and he had only to follow them. Number 1, gain her goodwill. Number 2, engage her troops. Number 3, hire them cheaply. And number 4, present the question as a favor on the part of the Republic. As an exercise involving nothing of vital moment but requiring some skill for its successful execution, it was well designed to test his practical capacities. His young reputation depended on it, for his appointment caused some jealousy in the office, notably in a certain Ser Antonio, and his friends wagered on him. As a parting word of advice, they reminded him of the first principle of bargaining, to keep cool, assume indifference, and lead the lady to make all the advances. In his case, such advice seemed superfluous, but he jotted it down, pocketed his instructions, and set forth for the wide, man-raising plains of Forli. The Countess was herself a virile character. She was known throughout Italy as a virago, and she gloried in the name. Beleaguered during a rebellion, she made herself famous by her retort to her besiegers who were holding her children and threatening to slaughter them. "I can make more!" she flung back from the battlements, and her sally made the rounds of Italy. She married 3 times. In the same virile spirit, she conducted her diplomacy, hard-mouthed, hot-tempered, hard-headed, and blunt, and the very match for a young diplomat. With her, Machiavelli had every reason to expect plain speaking and plain dealing. Memorizing his instructions, to keep cool, to lead her by a studied indifference, to make the advances, he pushed on through the auburn fields of Forli. No sooner had he alighted than he learned from an agent of her uncle, Ludovico Sforza, was in court negotiating for her troops. So he has a rival. The agent, moreover, was present at his first interview with the Countess, and that made it difficult to broach points 2 and 3. But if point 2, engage her troops, and point 3, hire them cheaply, were the real points of his mission, point 1 was the first. His instructions were explicit. Point 1, gain her goodwill. This required a dress. The Countess was forbidding, a robust mastiff of a matron, gruff with the lifelong habit of authority. She turned on him an august stare which warned him that here was a woman unaccustomed to making advances. Nevertheless, he followed instructions and wrapped himself in official reserve and well-feigned indifference. The first point was the condotta of her son, Ottaviano Riario. This young condottiere had been engaged for 3 months' service against Pisa. His contract had not been renewed. He was angling for a re-engagement, but he demanded an increase in salary. As I mentioned, condottieri always did that. Machiavelli's instructions were plain. He was to remind the Contessa that, quote, the Signoria was under no obligation to entertain this proposal, and that, if they did so, it would be only as a personal favor and in consideration of past services. So he's open to her by saying, we don't have to extend your guy's contract. He did so. No approach could have been more unfortunate. The suggestion of condescension immediately antagonized the maternal virago, and though he attempted some perfunctory compliments, dwelling on the affection of the Republic bore her and her many merits, and repeated that if she served it, she would not find his government ungrateful, he had no sooner concluded than she picked up his speech sharply. The actions of his government, she declared roundly, had always dissatisfied her. Though she relented as she looked at him, their words always pleased her. Then her face hardened, and in the map which she turned on him, he read no encouragement. She contradicted him sternly. His masters had never recognized her merits, and she proceeded to enlarge on them with a rough but loving hand, and as she did so, she became indignant. She sincerely hoped, that his masters would not be ungrateful as to dismiss whether they were under obligation to renew her son's contract, and she settled that point with a glare which allowed no rejoinder. The sun was setting when she concluded, and by then she had corrected and revised the whole message of the Signoria. She desired time, she said now, and to consider their request. And there was the first lesson ended. In his initial maneuver for position, Machiavelli had been completely outplayed. Not only had she made no advances, she had adroitly taken offense and placed him at a disadvantage. And to add to his discomfiture, the little scene had taken place under the watchful eye of the Milanese agent, of Ludovico Sforza. So not only did he fail to negotiate with her, but his failure was seen by a rival. It was galling. But tomorrow was another day, and he spent the night planning how to repair his errors. On the morrow, however, she did not even receive him, and the next day she sent her secretary to pump him. She had apparently taken his measure. Far from recovering ground, he lost it. The two secretaries sat down together for a chat, and while the tyro was guarded, the veteran played with him. Assuming a tone of disarming frankness, the Forleys let him into the secret of Milanese offer and succeeded in raising Machiavelli's bid to its limit, 10,000 or at most 12,000 ducats. Then he paused, looked worried, and suddenly changed the subject. He had been secretly informed, he said, that the Signoria meant to ask for a treaty of alliance in defense of its frontiers, and that, of course, Madonna would never consent, Madonna being Caterina Sforza. It was referred to as Madonna, even though there are other words that would apply a lot better. The significant gravity with which he made this warning remark, and the tone of the friendly reproach with which he colored it, impressed Machiavelli. He thought it prudent to hedge, and replied that such a treaty he knew nothing about. He would write home about it. Thereupon the Forleys smiled. It does not matter, he said lightly, and provided they could agree on other points, Madonna would certainly accept this one willingly, but not in writing. And, waving the treaty aside lightly, he reverted to the question of money, redoubling his unsatisfied pressure. Machiavelli was honest with himself. How it had happened, he hardly knew, but it had happened. He had offered everything and obtained nothing. He could not outbid Milan, and all that he would bring home would be the verbal goodwill of the Countess. The next day, however, she sent for him and received him with a sudden cordiality which flew to his head. He flew to his pen and wrote home, urging the Signoria to accept all of her demands. As he cooled off, he realized, and it became uncomfortable. He felt lurking smiles behind him whenever he turned. All this professional cat's play, in which he was cast as a cat's paw, irked him, and he begged the Signoria to recall him. He longed for the wine room where he could develop his theories, or the chancellery where everything was what it was. To be recalled to the palace, to his drudgery, to anything but to his self-confidence. To be standing again at his tall desk, chatting with his clerks, surrounded by his friends. To be listening to Biagio Buonoscori, true to his name, always of good help. The comfortable humdrum life of the office rose before him as he reread the letters which his chief clerk and bosom friend had stolen time to write to him. We all long for you, and most of all your Biagio, who talks of you every hour for a year and an hour, as you would not do if he were away. I have no doubt Madonna honors you and receives you gladly as you write, for many reasons which I will not repeat, and I should soon bore you. In my opinion, you have performed your mission with great credit so far, which gives me the greatest pleasure, because others will realize that though you are not so seasoned, you are not a whit inferior to Ser Antonio, your rival, who is so puffed up. Continue as you have begun. So far you have done us great honor. Notice by that letter, that's a letter that Machiavelli got from a friend of his, encouraging him. But notice what the letter is saying without saying it, which is that his progress is known in Florence. Dispatches have leaked, either from him or from other people. Biagio at least, good Biagio with his dog-like devotion, his comfortable mediocrity, his candid simplicity, believed in his success. And perhaps Biagio was right. The world was satisfied with seeming success, and he alone knew how baffled he was at court, how outwitted and fleeced and humiliated and unseasoned. He alone perceived his failure. But when after days of fretting and chafing the reply came from Florence, the Signoria agreed with Biagio. The terms of the Countess were accepted, and he was granted his recall. Machiavelli congratulated himself, but only on his luck. Nevertheless, he was too young not to be elated. With the final arrangement successfully completed, he was composing his last report when he felt a touch on his shoulder and turned to find the Milanese agent standing beside him. "It will not be necessary to write," he said. He explained that Madonna had changed her mind. Her troops were going to Milan. Machiavelli stared, rose, and bounding out of the room, abounding in words, expostulated breathlessly to the Countess, both with gestures and words. But in vain. She calmly confirmed her decision, without explanation or apology. All that she consented to say was that she had slept on it, and that, quote, the more one turns the thing over, the better one decides. As she was suckling a young child who was sick, she curtailed the interview. The scales fell from Machiavelli's eyes. Not only had she hoodwinked him, not only had he played blind man's bluff in her court, buffeted, beckoned, browbeaten, deluded, and at last dismissed, he had been untrue to himself. He had been satisfied like the vulgar with seeming success and contented with saving his face. That's what rankled. The riding home through the wide, man-raising plains of Forli. Notice the Homeric repetition of the man-raising plains of Forli. He felt the most insufferable of all sensations. He felt like an innocent. In the Chancellery, however, he was welcomed with open arms. He had accomplished nothing, it was true, but he had reported the process admirably, and his skill as an observer was recognized even by his superiors. His letters, with their terse, lucid style, their marshalling of all the evidence making of a decision, and their scrupulous caution, were commended. And now another field for the exercise of those qualities was awaiting him, the battlefield itself. Before he had time to brood on his defeat at Forli, he was plunged into the feverish activity of the Pisan War and employed in vigilantly reporting the conduct of Pagolo Vitelli. It became daily more suspect. It always does with condottieri. You are never going to get what you bargain for. They will always cheat you. The days continued. The delays continued. The demand for money, munitions, guns continued. If they continued much longer, Machiavelli wrote to the camp, phrasing the remonstrances of his superiors with all the vigor of his own. It would be impossible for half of Italy to support their artilleries. So far, we have spent 64,000 ducats on this expedition. We have mulcted, we have taxed everyone, and to send you the sum herewith, we have emptied our coffers. And he rammed in the conclusion, unless something were done promptly, quote, we shall undoubtedly be stranded, for if we have to furnish 6,000 more ducats, we shall despair of the victory. For a moment, these protests produced some effect. Vitelli went into action. A tower and a portion of the walls of Pisa were captured, and the fall of the city was hourly expected. Vitelli could have done that at any time. They always can. But anyway, let's get back to this. The next few news was a shock. An attack was launched, but as the Florentine troops poured through the breach, Vitelli and his brother, so the report ran, recalled them and even beat back with the flat of the sword those who refused to obey. A frenzy of indignation swept through Florence. The Signoria ordered an immediate investigation, declaring that they would no longer be led blindfold. In reply, the commissioners wrote to the camp that Vitelli insisted that he was certain of taking the city by treaty. Either you will not write us the truth, or you do not know it, wrote Machiavelli, and he did not know which was worse. We do not know what to say to this people, nor how to excuse ourselves. We seem to have been feeding them our fables, deluding them from day to day in vain promises of certain victory. He was bitter, and he had reason to be. Within an inch of victory, the prize had been snatched from them. Their resources were exhausted. The campaign languished. Fever broke out, and it was reluctantly decided to raise the camp. But someone had to foot the bill. The treachery of Vitelli was now confirmed by a report that papers had come into the hands of the French, proving his complicity with Milan and containing his promise to Ludovico Sforza to drag out the war. Ludovico, always Ludovico, everywhere in the background. That was the feeling that people had towards the Sforzas just in general, but also towards this particular Sforza. But the proof was galling that their mercenary captain, their condottieri captain, was treating with the enemy. It always happens that way. Whether the letters ever turn up or not, it's always the case that they're being paid by both sides. The smoldering fury flared up again. The commissioners were sent to the camp, ostensibly to pay off the army, but with sealed instruction, the secret of which was in Machiavelli's hands. He was now cool. He urged them to move prudently, not to err through too much courage or too much caution, neither hurrying unduly nor showing more circumspection than the occasion demanded. Vitelli was invited to dinner. The table was cleared. I'm guessing by this point that you can guess what the secret instructions are. The table was cleared, and he was quietly put under arrest. Next, his brother, Vitellozzo, was sick with fever. It was also seized. But he asked permission to dress, and while he was given that permission, he made his escape. The campaign had lasted 15 months, and that was the end of it. On October 1st, 1499, Vitelli was executed, and his head was displayed on a spear, with torches to light it, on the parapet of the palace, about which a crowd had gathered greater than any that had been seen since the execution of Savonarola. As for Ludovico, the French were approaching Milan, and he was in flight. In that pointed spectacle, with the mercenary head on a spear and the sanguine torches to light its sallow corruption, had the people at last seen the truth being, don't rely on foreign mercenaries? Machiavelli doubted it. The justice of that act was public and apparent, yet there were those who remained willfully blind to it. The truth was the last thing the world recognized. Here was the proof, in a letter intercepted on its way to Pisa, which came into his hands. To make matters worse, it was written by a chancellor of Lucca, and described the execution of Vitelli in official paper as a high-handed act of Florentine ill faith. Out of his burning patriotic pain, Machiavelli undertook to reply to it in his most scathing style. Quote, "A letter addressed to M. Jacopo Corbino, a canon of Pisa, having come into the hands of one of my friends, he brought it to me and I opened it in virtue of my office. I was not so surprised by its contents as by the fact that you should have written it, for I believe that we might expect a serious man and a public official like yourself to write in a manner not unbecoming his profession. Now, how it becomes a secretary of your magnificent state to tax such a republic as this with dishonor, I leave you to judge. Since whatever you say against any power in Italy must arouse the resentment of your masters more than anyone else, and if you are their mouthpiece, it will be assumed that they approve you, thus breeding hatred against them through no fault of theirs. I have undertaken to write, not so much to clear the city of your calumnies, as to warn you to be wiser hereafter. And this I feel bound to do as we pursue the same profession." And he reminded him of the first rudiments. Quote, "Among many things which prove what a man is, not the least important is to note how easily he believes what he is told, or how cautious he is in feigning what he wishes others to believe, so that whenever a man believes that he should not, what he should not, or feigns badly what he would have others believe, he may be said to be shallow and devoid of all prudence. I shall pass over the malice of your spirit as it was revealed in this letter, and confine myself to showing how foolishly you have either believed what you have said, or feigned what you wish to see disseminated to the discredit of the state of Florence." Because the letter was a lie. Florentines apprehended Vittorio because he had betrayed them, not because they betrayed him. The pen, so long poised, suddenly shot out. Quote, "First, I thank you for congratulating the Pisans on the glory you think they have won and the shame we have acquired, attributing all such remarks to the love you bear us. Next, how is it possible, let me ask you, that this city should have spent a treasure past computing, and that the Pisans should have defended themselves successfully, as you imply, but for the betrayal of Pagolo Vitelli? The slander that Vitelli had himself loaned his employers money he lanced properly. I ask you, what man, in his senses, what healthy mind, would believe that Pagolo Vitelli lent us money, and that the reason we took it was not to pay him? Do you not see, poor man, that this completely excuses our city and condemns Vitelli? For anyone who believes that Vitelli lent us money must also believe that Vitelli was a rascal, since, as all the world knows, he was in no position to advance us money unless he had received it by corruption, to betray us, or had saved it from the pay of his men. He's either defrauding us or he's defrauding them. But either way, it's a ridiculous accusation. He had been the cause of infinite disasters to our enterprise, and in either case deserved infinite punishment. To the other parts of your letter, since they rest on these 2 points, I feel it unnecessary to reply, nor do I feel called upon to justify his arrest, since this does not concern me, and if it did, there is no reason why it should be explained to you. I merely remind you that you will do well not to congratulate yourself too soon on the plots you say are going on about us, as you know nothing of our counterplots, and let me advise you, beloved brother, if you mean to indulge in your ill nature hereafter and offend without profit, that you do so in a manner more prudent. That is the kind of letter written by someone who has the power to hurt you. But it was not only the malice of slander abroad that he had to puncture. It was the mischief of credulity at home. There were actually those in Florence who still believed in Vitelli, and who were unconvinced of his guilt. And they included his closest friends. Biagio persisted in calling him an excellent man, and that was like Biagio. Of all average men, he never went beyond personalities. Biagio had been something of a Pisa fan, and still believed Savonarola an excellent man. And so, no doubt, he was. But what did it matter? It was not the man, it was the system, and Vitelli had been justly decapitated. Guilty or not, he was a product of that vicious mercenary system which, by making a traffic of warfare, inevitably led to betrayal and failure. What was a mercenary? A man without attachment to his employer, without animosity towards the enemy. The enemy of today was the friend of tomorrow, with only a trifle of a stipend to march for whom a decisive action meant the end of his pay, and victory was worse than defeat. Hence all of those sham battles, when, as at Anghiari, 2 armies left but 1 casualty on the field at the end of the hard-fought day. That was the mockery that Leonardo da Vinci got. His grand fresco was going to be the Battle of Anghiari, but it was a farce. And Michelangelo rightly ribbed him for that. But anyway. Hence the victory at Fornovo, when the French slipped through while the mercenaries were looting their baggage. Hence all the disasters of Italy. And Machiavelli punctuated the argument with indignant pauses, while Biagio walked meekly beside him, and the theme carried them slowly from the chancery to the wine-room. Hence it was that Charles VIII passed from one end of the peninsula to another, chalk in hand, choosing his billets, and now the French were returning, and the same thing would repeat itself. There was only one solution. How long before the Republic saw the light? Yet even it did not appreciate the real significance of that mercenary head on the parapet. Vitelli was the victim of their own folly, and having beheaded him, they would begin another. How long would they muddle along in half measures? There was only one solution. Impractical? But practical men, in their short-sightedness, were the most visionary of all. Only one solution, the militia. And that brought them to the wine-room. In the wine-room, the discussion continued. Who expected honor, honesty, and patriotism of a mercenary? Sentiment was essential to force. It was a potent factor in action. That imponderable element was the most practical of all, perhaps, and must be included in any working political philosophy. That was Machiavelli's argument. But if you don't believe in your cause, you will betray it. And in the wine-room, the argument mellowed. Force without faith was nothing. Yes, Savonarola was right. That obstinate, wrong-headed man was right. Though everything in the world was accomplished by force, nothing was achieved without faith. Faith without force without faith, were equally futile. Biagio listened, as he had long ago listened to the friar, devoutly. Machiavelli, too, had something of the prophet, and the same burning zeal, the same passion for the absolute and the antithetical. And he was also a voice crying out in the wilderness, and his piercing eyes were big with vision. But Biagio could not lead him to talk of the friar. Why was it that the friar crept into every discussion, into every tap room? Machiavelli merely called for a new deal of cards and a fresh flask of wine. He had no opinion of the friar, except what he had always said, that he was a very astute man and a simpleton. And Biagio accepted the old paradox with a submissive, uncomplaining, uncomprehending smile, and was silent. That's a very interesting thing. He tells us that Machiavelli never talked publicly about Savonarola. But silence was the last word of the friar, and when they walked home through the piazza, where he was mute, now, they paused, and the persistent promptings arose anew. Faith. Yes. The experience of the past year, the faithlessness of Vitelli, the mercenaries of Ludovico, and Caterina Sforza, the mutability of fortune, the deception and self-deception of men, everything led Machiavelli by the logic of his own thinking to the need of faith. But faith in what? Overhead in the void, the stars span the ultimate uncertainty. No, no, not in God, but in man. Maybe there were one. Maybe the one was certain. All was dark, and the only clue in nature, the one guide of man, was self-confidence. That is the part of a long portrait of Machiavelli the man, not Machiavelli the disembodied philosopher, in Man of the Renaissance. Man of the Renaissance by Ralph Roeder. This is an old Time Inc. paperback that just goes on like that for hundreds of pages of just great, underlinable, pungent prose. Prose that never takes your attention for granted, that never resorts to just relaying facts. Just wonderful stuff. Just wonderful stuff. Very much akin with Francis Hackett in his Life of Henry VIII, that sort of thing. And all about the ideas that would eventually lead Machiavelli to exile and disgrace, because he eventually did convince people that a citizen militia was the way to go, and it wasn't. It didn't work. It failed, and led to his disgrace. But that's later on in the book. That's enough of an excerpt from Deep Space Nine for now. And the reason why I read you from The Man of the Renaissance by Ralph Roeder instead of reading from Deep Space Nine is because all Deep Space Nine novels stink. Thank you, BookTube.